Hello everyone, I'm Ryan the Raptor Guy, and welcome to episode number 3 of PaleoMania. In the past 2 episodes of our mini-series, The True History of Life, we learned how the Genesis flood utterly destroyed the entire pre-flood world. The flood destroyed every land-living, air-breathing thing not on Noah's Ark. This episode is about what happened next. The short period of time following the Genesis flood was a time of strange climate upheavals and a weird slew of creatures that you couldn't conceive in your wildest dreams, or nightmares in some cases. All that and more in just a moment. Most people think that the world was a pretty quiet place after the flood. Since the catastrophe was over, everything was fine and dandy and everything is back to normal. But that couldn't be further from the truth. The rock layers that were laid down after the flood, called Cenozoic rock layers, as you'll recall from the previous 2 episodes, Cenozoic rock layers are the ones on the top of the geologic column. They speak of a very violent period of time lasting for centuries after the flood. It took a while for the Earth to recover from such a major catastrophe. These post-flood rock layers differ from flood deposit rock layers because they're of more regional extent. When you look at rocks that were deposited during the flood, they cover vast areas. Many of them even cover continents, some of them cross oceans and continents. They're huge rock layers. But when we're dealing with Cenozoic rock layers, they're usually restricted to a pretty small range. These post-flood rock layers were laid down by local catastrophes, including local floods, volcanic eruptions, and things like that. And as we go upward through the Cenozoic rock layers, you'll find that these catastrophes tend to decline in intensity as time passes. That brief period of time following the flood can be broken up into 3 periods of time. The first one is the Paleogene, the second is the Neogene period, and the third is the Quaternary period. But we're going to focus primarily on the Paleogene and Neogene periods in this episode. Most creation geologists and paleontologists believe that the Paleogene period lasted for the first few decades following the flood. Plant life actually started to recolonize the Earth even before the flood ended, so they had a head start. As you'll recall from Genesis, a dove brought an olive branch back to Noah when they were still on the ark, before the waters had completely receded off of the continents. And the fossil record indicates that plants like ferns and other similar plant life was starting to grow just after the flood ended. So this was perfect for animals that were just coming off the ark. They could spread around the world relatively quickly, and they'd have and the herbivores anyway, would have lots of food to eat because plants had already started to regrow. During the Paleogene, the Earth was a lot warmer than today. The major reason for this is because during the flood, all the tectonic and volcanic activity happening underneath the Earth's surface left the ocean very warm. Even in places like the Arctic Ocean, the water would have been around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The warmer oceans created a much warmer climate all around the globe. That includes places like the polar regions. Ellesmere Island is located northwest of Greenland, above the Arctic Circle. Despite its frigid, barren climate of today, early post-flood fossils from Ellesmere Island indicate that the island was a lush, tropical place full of tropical forests and swamps and a myriad of plants and animals. On Ellesmere Island, we find fossils of animals like alligators, lemur-like primates, small horse-like mammals, tapirs, giant tortoises, boa constrictors, monitor lizards, and even a hippo-like mammal called Coryphodon. And last year, scientists discovered that there was also a giant species of bird living on Ellesmere Island, called Gastornis. Now, Gastornis wasn't a new species, but up until last year, scientists had only found fossils of this giant bird in places like Europe and North America, places like Wyoming, Colorado. How big was this bird? Well, fossil skeletons tell us that Gastornis stood around 6 feet tall. Thankfully, this animal was an herbivore, eating nuts and fruit. Life flourished away from the poles too. In places like the Cerrejón Formation in Colombia, South America, we find a community of animals and plants that's very similar to plants and animals that we still find in the same region today, just a few tens of miles away even. The Cerrejón Formation reveals that a lot of post-flood swamp-living animals and plants would have lived there. But one sticks out, and it's called Titanoboa. Titanoboa was a giant cousin of the modern anaconda, and it grew over 40 feet long, and it weighed as much as a small car.
Scientists discovered its fossils in a mine big enough to swallow a cow just fine, but it fed on giant turtles and snub-nosed crocodiles. It's hard not to be impressed by such a massive reptile.
It's a huge snake. The world didn't stay warm and wet for very long. After the flood, volcanic activity continued to pump loads of volcanic debris, like ash and volcanic dust, into the atmosphere. And all of that volcanic debris blocked a lot of the sun's heat. As the planet cooled, the tropical forests that covered much of the Earth began to recede, and were replaced by drier grassy plains. Since grass is composed partly of tiny sand-like particles, and it isn't very nutritious, it was very difficult for many animals to adapt to this new change in their diet. And frankly, many animals just couldn't cope. Due to the changing climate, many species of animals died out, although some were able to adapt and thrive on these new grassy plains. Some of those animals include small rhinoceros like Teloceros and Miniseries, and humpless camels, and even small horses. It was during this time that the different kinds of mammals that had come off the ark a few decades before, they started to diversify and speciate. And many different species arose at this time. Creation scientists believe that the dog-sized horse, Mesohippus, or a close cousin, may be the ancestor of all modern horses, including the domestic horses and zebras and donkeys. This is because it's one of the first true horses that we find in the fossil record after the flood. Initially, Mesohippus and its other horse cousins were mainly browsers, meaning they ate most of the leaves off of small trees and bushes. But as the climate dried and the forests began to recede, these horses had to adapt. They grew larger, then they grew larger guts so they could digest tougher plants, and their teeth even changed so that they'd be able to cope with the tough, fibrous grasses that they were now eating. Contrary to what evolutionists believe, this isn't evolution in action. This isn't the evolution of the horse. Why? Well, because this is just variation within a kind of animal that God originally created. There's no new genes being added to the horse's genetic code. No matter what kind of variations of horses came from Mesohippus or a horse cousin, they're all still horses. There's no evolution actually happening here. There's not one kind of animal changing into another kind of animal. Living on the open grassy plains brought a host of new dangers that horses and other grazing animals had to deal with. There were lots of predators that were also adapting successfully to the changing climate, and they were thriving on these plains. Some of those early predators after the flood were creatures like the hyenodonts and bear dogs. Hyenodonts were one of the first mammalian predators to become really widespread and common in the post-flood era. And contrary to their name, hyenodonts aren't really related to hyenas. They were dog-like, but they weren't dogs either. They were their own unique group, and they came in a wide range of sizes. Some were about the size of small dogs, and others were the size of wolves. And in Asia, there were hyenodonts that grew the size of rhinoceros. Another post-flood animal that would have competed with the bear dogs and hyenodonts for food and territory were the pig-like Intelidox. Like their modern-day pig lookalikes, Intelidox were omnivorous, eating both meat, usually in the form of smaller animals, and roots and bulbs and things like that. The largest species of Intelidox that we found so far is Daedon. Daedon was a pretty big animal. It stood 6 feet tall at the shoulders. And while scientists believe that it was quite capable of bringing down its own food, it was much happier to steal the kills of other predators. So after the flood, within several decades, tropical forests had sprung up all over the earth and then receded and were replaced by grassy plains, and a myriad of different animals learned to thrive in these changing climates. This is also about the time that Antarctica was beginning to freeze over. But what were humans doing during this time in history? By roughly 4,250 years ago, a century after the flood, humanity's numbers were beginning to increase again. Now, after the flood, God told both animals and humans that they were to spread across and multiply and fill the earth. The animals obeyed this command, but humans did not. According to Genesis 11, humanity pretty much stayed around the Middle East, and as their population grew, they began to build a giant tower, later called the Tower of Babel, that would reach into the heavens, so they claimed. Again, God decided to take action, and he confused their languages. So now different people groups were speaking different languages. They couldn't communicate with each other. They didn't have Rosetta Stone and other language translating devices back then. So they were forced to split. Different people groups would venture out to different parts of the world. This is why we have different human groups today. This is why we have the Chinese, the Africans, Native Americans, Inuits, Chinese, Aborigines, and so on. It's because the population of humans split apart and traveled to different parts of the world. As they went to different parts of the world, people became accustomed and adapted to the different environments that they faced, and they developed certain features. For example, Africans developed darker skin, as you can see, so that they could better withstand the harsh sun in Africa. There are some other factors at play as well, but that's a whole nother topic. As humans and animals spread across the earth and multiplied, they would have realized that the climate was changing once again. Planet Earth was about to experience one more climate-changing event that would completely change the geography of the Earth and cover it in thousands of feet of ice. The Ice Age. In our final episode of The True History of Life, we'll look at how both animals and humans learned to cope and survive during the coolest period in Earth's history. Thank you for watching today's episode of PaleoMania. Please be sure to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe below for more content just like this, follow me on Instagram for updates, and remember, every fossil has a story to tell. See you next time.